Welcome to Below the Surface podcast. Today we're talking to Linda Apthorpe. Linda works with Phil Hibbs at Hibbs and Associates. You remember Phil from our second or third episode when we talked about the asbestos in mulch. I will let Linda introduce herself. So Linda, thanks for doing this and welcome.
Thank you very much.
James can't make it today. I'm really sorry. He apologizes. So you have to live with me today. Linda, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Well, thank you for the invitation to have a chat today. So I'm an occupational hygienist. I've been around in space working in occupational hygiene for over 30 years. Predominantly, most of that has been as a consultant. And for the last 10 years, or perhaps a little bit more, I've also been a lecturer at the University of Wollongong. So actually teaching occupational hygiene to undergrad, but mostly postgraduate students who want to expand their knowledge in the occupational hygiene space and then to work professionally as a professional occupational hygienist.
I did not know you were a lecturer. I can call you Professor Linda.
No, well, not quite. So, my background is in the laboratory as well as out on field work and doing a lot of site work in lots of different environments.
You see my hairstyle, if you want to call it that. I spent the first few hours of today in a Tyvek suit, sweating. It's these, my God, I hate those. And what can I say? So you are a lab expert for analysis for asbestos. And my first question to you is, when I bring you a sample, I'm talking about give you a 500 milliliter soil sample that we need to take in accordance with the NEPM, the National Environmental Protection Measure. I submit that, and then at some stage, I get a report back from you that states all sorts of things on that. So in between the time of me dropping it off and you sending me the report, what happens?
So the first thing to do with the sample is to ensure that it's dry. If it's not dry, then it does need to be dried. And then the thing is that it needs to be sieved. So it will be sieved if you're using 4964, Australian Standard 4964, it'll be sieved using a 10 and a 2 mil sieve. If you're now using AS5370, which is the brand new Australian standard for identification, you'll be using a 7 and a 2 mil sieve. So the idea is to use the sieves to break up the samples into manageable chunks. So, for example, +7 or +10 mil fraction does need to be 100% of that needs to be examined to make sure that if there's anything suspicious that looks like asbestos, then it needs to be taken out and then analysed to confirm if there's asbestos in that material.
The +10 millimeter and the plus now in the new standard, we talk about the new standard in a minute, +7 millimeter samples, fragments or pieces or whatever fraction, that's what I think the term is so the +10, +7 millimeter fraction. Yeah. That's basically the little gravelly stuff. And you take that out of the sample and you inspect it carefully visually.
So 100% of that needs to be analysed. You're actually looking at it with, if you can, use a stereo microscopy or a magnifying glass to actually identify anything that looks a bit fibrous. If it does, then you need to analyse it with the stereo microscope and then any fibres that are found to confirm what they are using the polarised light microscope. So it's important to think about these steps when considering how much it costs to get your sample analysed by a NATA accredited facility. So then the next bit is to analyse the +2 mil fraction. And again, that's using stereo microscopy, the same deal. You're looking for anything that looks a bit fibrous to then extract it out and then confirm if those fibres are asbestos.
That also all needs to be looked at pretty similarly to the +10.
Anything between 2 and either 7 or 2 and 10 needs to be analysed. And so all of that needs to be analysed. There's no subsampling there to see if there's any fibrous material there and then analyse those fibres.
Mm-hmm.
And
then we move on to the little ones, to the below 2.
Yeah, so the sub 2 mil fraction, That's where usually the bulk of the material is in terms of your 500 ml sample. So if it's more than about 30 to 60 grams, then that does need to be subsampled using a validated subsampling technique. You can't just kind of grab in the dish or the bucket or the bag or the bottom of the pans and just grab a spoonful out of that. That's not acceptable. So because soil is a non-homogeneous matrix, it must be subsampled using a validated technique. So then you take it down to about 30 to 60 grams, and then you analyse 100% of that in using the stereo microscope.
Excellent. So that's a fair bit of work, and a lot of it's very human labor intensive.
You can't just do this in 5 minutes, and you can't put it in a machine and just expect the machine to tell you the answer. It relies on human competency of the analyst, and it does take a significant amount of time.
Okay, then you prepare a report, right? And
we got another step to do first.
What's that one?
If you're using Australian Standard 4964, and
Yes.
lots of labs will still be using that until the conversion occurs, then there's another thing called the trace analysis, which is analysing the residual amount of material present as you tip out the samples from your Petri dish.
That's of the 40 or 50 grams that you subsampled with your approved methodology.
Yeah, so you tip out your sample when you've finished analysing it.
Yeah.
You tip it out, and the residue that's in the bottom of the dish, then you analyse that very fine material to see if there's any free fibres that could be distributed throughout the sample that you've missed using the stereo microscope.
Okay. Are you done then?
Yeah. So if you're using Australian Standard 5370, this is one of the differences between the two methods. It's called residual analysis, and you do that for any sample where you have not already found asbestos. That's different to 4964 because 4964 says that you need to do trace analysis on every soil sample, whether you find asbestos or not.
I'll get back to the new standards and the old standards in a minute. Okay. So we have a sample. You dry it. Do you crush it at all?
You should be crushing it if it's got big chunks of clay in it, because you don't know what's inside those chunks of clay. There could be embedded fibres or embedded building materials which contain asbestos.
Okay. Plus 10, you very, very carefully look at it, the plus 10 millimeters or plus 7 millimeters. The reason why I insist on the 7 on the 10, because in the National Environmental Protection Measure, the 7 millimeters is a very critical size. And our old standard had the 10 millimeters in it. I'm glad to hear that they have now been aligned. What if I give you way more than 500 milliliters, for example?
It's still the same process.
Oh, okay, you poor guys. All right, I will keep that in mind. Okay. And then with the less than 2, which is usually the bulk of it, gets subdivided in an approved manner, and you mentioned that it's very heterogeneous, and I don't want to get into it, but it's one of my bugbears is that when we take samples of soil, and not necessarily for asbestos, but when we take samples for soil for the usual suspect analyses, that we do not sample properly. It's one of my bugbears. I've had an entire 1.5 hour talk with Ross McFarland on this. You can go back and listen to it. It's called the Sampling Revolution. But I'm glad to see that you guys are at least say, hey, this is heterogeneous. There has to be an approved and a known way of subdividing this. And that's what happens. And then you take a 40 or 50 grams out of that subdivided sample.
Well, it depends. You've got about 30 to 60 grams in 4964, and in 5370, it's a little bit more prescriptive with the total amount that you can take. But it's in that ballpark. And you have to analyse 100% of that material, right? You can't then further subsample it. So it has to be in a manageable amount to be representative of the whole.
So you analyze the 30 to 60 grams, fine, all under the microscope. So you are on one sample, you are for sure spending at least an hour on this, and you're staring through microscope for an hour for one sample, at least for one sample. Am I in the ballpark figure here?
It depends on the type of sample it is. If it's a matrix that's got a lot of organic matter in it, such as a lot of decayed roots and decayed organic matter, that takes a lot longer because what looks like a root might also look like a bundle of asbestos fibers. So you have to take a lot of care and go through that matrix very, very slowly.
Good. So, and then you're not done. Then you need to take your trace analysis. And when I look at lab reports here, that's pretty much from the top to the bottom what labs report. So they report, the greater than 7 millimeter, it's called an estimation. Then they call it fibrous and asbestos fines, which is basically anything below 7 that comes straight out of the NEPM.
Well, remember that a laboratory should not be reporting anything that is considered an opinion, so such as whether it's friable or non-friable according to the legislation. So then the terms FA, fibrous asbestos, and asbestos fines are not terms that are linked to the legislation. So that's definitely soil-related stuff, and it's definitely part of the NEPM and also the WA document because it considers different factors than that need to be considered with soils.
Yes, the NEPM, our main guidance, is very strict about this and says anything that is less than 7 millimeters needs to be considered friable. And that's how it gets interpreted. What then gets not read in the NEPM is, hey guys, I mean, that's only the first step. We only made that 7 millimeter distinction because, if something is smaller than 7 millimeters, what has happened to this piece? Why is this less than 7 millimeters in the first place, right? Because bonded asbestos generally is bonded in a matrix and doesn't appear unless you crushed it or broke it or sanded it or something. They don't release fibers. But if you find something that's less than 7 millimeters, like, wow, something must have gone on here to break this into these small pieces. And it drives me absolutely nuts when people just blindly call anything that's 7 millimeters friable asbestos and call for Class A removal lists on 2-hectare sites without any further investigation, without looking a little bit further, getting a licensed asbestos assessor or someone like you involved and say, hey, here are my samples. Are we really talking friable asbestos here? Do I really have to put every worker through a decontamination unit the moment they want to come out and have a sandwich? Is this really necessary? And it drives me crazy when these steps are not done. Less than 7 millimeters, that's friable, I'm out of here. I stopped my rant now. Anyway.
I hear you.
Well, also the trace analysis, right? It's like, this is one of please correct me if I'm wrong, but the trace analysis is super important because that one tells you not necessarily if there's any asbestos in that sample, which is one thing we want to know, but the single most important thing you want to know about asbestos is, does it manage to get into the air? Because that's where it becomes dangerous. As long as I have, no matter how much concentration in the soil, in a soil matrix, it is in itself not a risk, is not dangerous. So we need to look at the trace analysis because the trace analysis, am I right in saying, is basically you could write there, instead of saying trace analysis, you could say respirable fibers present or presence of respirable fibers. Is that right?
Well, the trace analysis is really going to give you information about whether there are free, loose, if you like, fibres in a matrix. The term respirable is kind of a misnomer because you can't determine respirable fibres using the magnification of the polarised light microscope that's normally used for analysis of asbestos identification. So it's kind of a misnomer to say it's respirable, but you're bang on in terms of you want to know if there are free fibres present because when the soil is moved, it could be lifted into a truck, it could be relocated from point A to point B, then there is an opportunity for fibres to become airborne, and that absolutely is the real issue. It is a risk to health via inhalation.
Yes. All right, we've spent way too much time on this. Let me go to my next questions for you. Yes, the new standard. So it used to be, as you know, the number 4964, and that has now been replaced, and I read the first time I read about this is in the Office of the Chief Scientist and Engineer paper, in the Oxy paper. So there's a new standard now, Australian Standard 5370. I need to get another rant in here. I will never understand why Australian standards are behind a paywall, why you have to pay to access an Australian standard, and not a little either. As long as something becomes part of an industry standard, and something you cannot work in our industry without those, I am of the opinion you cannot charge for that material. It's like putting the NEPM or the safe work codes of practice behind a paywall. I have no idea who is behind that Australian standards you have to pay for a fair bit of money too. Do you know what's going on here?
No, I don't.
No.
No, I
Okay.
don't. I can't really
So
comment on that. I don't know.
that's something that needs to change. You cannot make things that are de facto regulations behind a paywall. This is insane. Anyhow, new standard. You were on the committee that developed the new Australian Standard 5370. How many years was that in the making?
Lots. A lot of years, on the age 4964 had been on the age standards list for a while, and it had been talked about in the committee, and it took some time for the project to really get a snowball effect to actually make it happen. And when it did happen, it still did take quite a significant amount of time to get through.
Mm-hmm. So what's new? What's the main difference between AS 4964 and the new 5370? Don't tell me everything, but the key points. We've already mentioned some of them.
Yeah, so we have already mentioned something. One of the main things is that 4964 was useful, it had obviously for bulk materials, for soils and for ores, but 5370 actually expands that and provides more context, more information, flow charts and analytical processes for non-homogeneous matrices such as soils, dusts, aggregates and mineral ores.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually a much more structured approach, which is excellent because that helps soil remediation people, recycled aggregates and from construction and demolition waste, and also from other aspects. So that's one really good thing about it. It also has a defined reporting limit, which is the detection limit, which is 0.01%. Now, this is one of the points of conjecture between the two documents, is that the new standard, which is the adoption of the old ISO standard with Australian modifications, is a defined detection limit of 0.01%. Now, what that means is it's not possible to report any asbestos below that, which then heads into the situation with some regulators for their aspects of what they do.
So on that method, on 5370, the detection limit is also the reporting limit.
Yeah.
Okay, is that normal for?
Well, it's the way it is for this particular thing. The detection limit means that you can't report anything less than that. Anything less than that has a greater uncertainty in it, and so therefore it's appropriate. It's fit for purpose, this method, where it is either above 0.01% or it's not detected at 0.01%.
Okay, leads me immediately to the Oxy paper, where the chief scientist recommends to the New South Wales government a level of 0.001%, a level that is obviously 10 times lower than the reporting / detection limit of the method we are using. What's going on here?
So there's a few reasons for that. Obviously, it's taking on the information from the NEPM and WA documentation, and that threshold of 0.001% is based on a whole bunch of factors, which and also some published papers where some people did some research some years ago, and this level was decided, and then an extra margin of safety was applied to get to this 0.001%.
Look, it's okay. I've read the paper and Swartjes and Trump and Addison. I'm all over this. I understand and I understand we had Pirino Otnes on. She explained very well why in Australia we have decided to go lower than what, for example, Addison in his papers recommends. I have no problem with that as such. What I have a problem with is that we have a method that can't go that low or shouldn't go that low, and yet we have standards, and the Australian standard goes to 0.01%, so 10 behind, and the chief scientist recommends a threshold level for asbestos in waste and recyclable material of 0.00, so 0.001%, which is 1/10 lower. That is lower, and I understand where it comes from, but you just told me that the reporting limit and the detection limit of the method is 10 times higher than what we need to report on. Something's fishy here.
Well, not necessarily. Remember, the Oxy report actually says that a threshold should exist where previously, for some jurisdictions, a threshold was not possible. They were expecting zero, and it's very difficult to measure and analyse anything to zero because it's based on the detection limit of the method. So that kind of seems unusual to specify a threshold of zero, which is impossible to achieve in reality. So a threshold of 0.001% is achievable when you use the combination of the analytical results with the gravimetric analysis. And so that's some mathematics for the soil people who do that work. From the lab side of things, our report should only be if there is asbestos above that or below, and of course nothing if it is below. It's not detected at that limit. And remember that this technique is not it's a qualitative technique. It's not a quantitative analysis.
AS5370
and 4964
is a
they
qualitative,
are
so basically
techniques.
a yes or no.
Yes.
Is that right?
And that matches Australian legislation if you think about it. Yeah.
I understand. Whether that makes sense or not is another question, right? So we don't have to go to the zero tolerance, which is of course an embarrassment that we have that, even that this made it into the law is just that's a banana republic move. That is crazy, and I will never stop talking about it and complaining about it. What I am still not quite sure about is when you say that we have a new standard that can detect 0.01%, and yet the recommendation from the chief scientist is 10 times lower, we cannot reliably report that. That's the definition of a detection limit. Why are we going 10 times lower? It cannot be reliably reported.
That's why you have to use a gravimetric analysis, which is a challenge. There is absolutely a challenge here with the detection limit of a validated published method specifying it is 0.01%. It is quite a challenge when you think that we need a threshold for recycled materials, for recovered fines, for soils, and moving into that 0.001% range.
Let me drill you a little bit more on this. Let's go up a notch. I give you a ruler that is 30 centimeters long and has no other signs on it. I could tell you this is 30 centimeters long, okay? And I ask you to measure the distance from you to your wall, and you will be able to measure that out 30 and 30 and 30 in a little bit, okay? But you will not be able to tell me to the centimeter how far away from the wall you are. So basically, you will be able to tell me I'm between five rulers and 6 rulers. That's it. That's as low, as precise as you can get if all I give you is a 30 centimeter ruler. If all I give you is a lab methodology that can go down to 0.01%, 10, okay, 0.01%, and I ask you to give me a 0.001% result, that would be the equivalent of asking you, here is the ruler, how many centimeters are you away from the wall? Where am I wrong here?
Remember that the laboratory is using a standard validated technique, and that's all they can report to. They can't report to 0.001%. So that is the requirement for consultants who collect cell samples and so on to use a gravimetric method to actually get you lower to that, because it's all based on volume.
explain this gravimetric. You mentioned it. I just don't understand. What's the gravimetric method?
I'm going to leave that to the soil experts because I do what I do in the lab.
I mean, I thought I was going to get some clarity on this.
Look, and look, it's true. There does need to be clarity, and I think some groups are working together to form some more consistent guidance for people in this space because it is confusing. The mathematics is confusing, and it is important for us to be operating on a consistent approach with results that are reliable. And so there are some groups who are now starting to think about, well, what can we do in this space to use the information obtained from analytical results, which go to 0.01%, and then what the next steps are. So it is consistent, it's reliable, and it gives the right guidance to people in this space.
All right, I'll trust you.
So it's a work in progress.
Okay, thank you for that. Hey, how are the labs? I've only heard about this new standard by accident by reading the Oxy paper. How are labs going on? Is NATA on board with this method? Yes?
Yes,
NATA, sorry, the National Authority of Testing. Sorry, not National Authority of Testing?
National Association of Testing Authorities, yes.
Thank you.
So NATA are right across this, and they're preparing some information to give to their accredited facilities with some additional guidance on this and to apply it to the requirements for accredited laboratories who are accredited to the ISO 17025 standard for laboratories. So they are in the space of providing that guidance, which is going to be well received when it comes.
Okay, so are there labs out there that are already certified for 5370, the new standard?
My understanding is that the lots of labs are wanting to become accredited, and in the conversion process, some are a little bit more keen than others, and I understand that some labs already do have that accreditation, which is great.
Okay. Move on to the next one. I've mentioned the Oxy report, the Office of the Chief Scientist and Engineer. Do you want to give me we've already had 2 podcasts on it. So what's your opinion about that paper?
Who did you talk to in that podcast?
So the first one was where James and I just announced it, and the second one was with just the most recent episode with Sarah Mansfield, who is a lawyer. Not only a very good lawyer, but she has a tremendous understanding of environmental law, and also I admired her detailed knowledge in my field, right, where I'm supposed to be the expert. I think, man, I wish I knew as much about the law as she knows about my field. So we looked at it from a legal point of view, what it means for the protection of the Environmental Operations Act, but it was more or less a legal take. What will have to change legally if this all gets implemented? So from a technical point of view, do you have any comments? Have you read it, or have you at least read some summaries of it?
It was specifically designed for the recovered fines area, and also then expanded for the mulch situation, which we all sort of lived through a year or so ago.
Yeah, you're only a year late, guys.
So the report pulled together some really important information and has listed out multiple recommendations, including the adoption of a threshold to actually make sense of this, because this problem is not going to go away, and it's important that the recycled industry, whether it be for soil that can be remediated to a certain standard for end use, or for recovered fines, for recycled aggregates, it's important that we have some established thresholds, because it's impossible and unpractical and unworkable to have a zero tolerance.
Yeah. Look, nobody except for a bunch of politicians and one chief justice understands how we could end up in this. This is again. I'm not going there. I've
probably good.
So I am working a lot in the ASBIN, so in the asbestos in soil space, of course, as an environmental and a remediation consultant. From your side of things, so you said you're out in the field an awful lot. What, in your opinion, what should change in our in our guidance from the NEPM as far as assessments of asbestos is concerned?
Not
Soils.
really in the soil space. Out on the field, my work is really to do with more traditional occupational hygiene measurements for silica and other more traditional occupational hygiene stuff. So the hazmat people and the asbestos in soil people, they have their expertise in that area, and it is important for them to be up to speed with these latest changes. And it's a difficult area to be in. I absolutely appreciate that, particularly when consider extensive amounts of soil have been, with very limited to no contamination, have been disposed of as asbestos waste. And in this day and age, I think, the idea of a threshold is practical because it actually allows us to deal with this in a much more pragmatic way.
So look, the Oxy report actually goes into it and has a couple of recommendations, and we discussed them with Sarah Mansfield on the last podcast. They recommended that, I think they recommend nationwide training will developed for assessments of asbestos in soil or in waste, in recovered fines in that case, or asbestos in soil. And I can only fully support that. I would even say things that have to change in that area are, I wouldn't mind having a special, we have licensed asbestos assessors, and they come from the built environment, and their experience is in the built environment. And I would argue that we need a licensed asbestos assessor with a specialty in aspens, in asbestos in soils. The licensed asbestos assessors, as important a role as they are playing, their expertise doesn't directly relate to contaminated sites. And that's just a huge knowledge gap that sits there. And I have a feeling there needs to be another step or another license that deals with asbestos in soils. Because the way how it comes over, we are basically the little cousin, or the cousin of the built environment here, and things don't apply. They don't. So that would be one of my suggestions.
Well, you have to get that guidance up first up, and when you have all the resources available, then it's important to train everyone, and then maybe some other scheme to determine competency is required, because it's very easy to make significant mistakes which cost extensive amounts of money due to incorrect decisions or incorrect sampling, incorrect interpretation of results, etc.
Well, what happens at the moment, I can tell you this, is because there is a lack of training, and there is a lack of asbestos in soil awareness. That little bit in the NEPM and then the WA, the Western Australian guidelines. Yeah, fair enough. You can read that as much as you want, but whenever you want to learn more, you end up in an asbestos removal course, be it friable or bonded or whichever one it is, or an asbestos removal supervisor course. And I've done all those, but they don't tell me anything about asbestos in soil. They all are focused on the built environment, and I get it. That's where this comes from. But I have a feeling we are sitting in my industry. We're sitting here not properly educated, and you can't even get properly educated because the courses are not out there. And what happens is that people say, well, I'm not going to be the one making calls here, so I'm going to make the single most conservative call I can make, because either I don't know, or I don't want to get in the crossfire, or you know what, my legal team says that's the best way to go. Let's cover our bums before we do anything, no matter if it costs our client a few $1,000,000. That's oil that we need. Class A removalist on that side. That's what's happening at the moment in our industry. And there's something needs to change. Asbestos in soils is too big an area with too much money involved that we have people running around that haven't got proper training. We can't get it.
This
has become a Gunnar rant. My censorship team and compliance team is gonna go through this with a fine-tooth comb. Do you want to add anything to my rant? Do you have your own rant?
No, I don't want to have any rants, thank you.
Well, Linda, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you. I know how busy you are, and I'm so sorry we had to reschedule several times, and now is an
All
awkward
good.
time that I interview you. But thank you so much for doing this, and I really appreciate it. When you bump into Phil, say hi from me, and thank you again for taking the time.
Okay, Gunnar. No problem. Bye bye.
Bye.